Hello and welcome to I Can Relate. I'm Jessica Burns. This podcast takes us on people's journeys through personal and sometimes sensitive experiences. These are usually topics that are not spoken about, and the hope here is that by bringing them to light, it'll help others feel less alone in what they're going through. I look forward to embarking on this journey with you as we develop a greater understanding and empathy for one another. Today, I sit down with two generations of women, from baby boomers to millennials, to discuss how attitudes towards sex and gender roles have changed in just one generation. Lauren and Karen come not just from two very different generations, but two different backgrounds, and it's very interesting to see how it comes together and impacts their attitudes towards sex as adults. We also cover topics on consent, rape, safety issues, so please note this episode may be triggering. Hello and welcome, Karen and Lauren. How are you guys doing?
Really well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I miss you both so much. So for the listeners out there, Karen and Lauren are from Canada. So Lauren, you're in Montreal, right?
Right, I am.
How's it going?
It's good. Montreal has two seasons, in my opinion. Gorgeous heaven. Actually, three seasons. There's gorgeous heaven, sparkly, magical winter wonderland, and slushy depression. And right now we're bordering the slushy depression, gorgeous heaven season.
Got it.
It's
Okay.
Nice. Yes.
and Karen, you've fled to Florida. How's it going down there?
I did. Well, Florida is an incredibly open state, with COVID going on. So, people are wearing their masks inside stores, but other than that, it is like life as usual. So I have to admit it was a pretty good move on our part, to come down. We got down here in January, a little later than usual. I usually come in November for the winter season, but it's great. It's 31 degrees Celsius and warm, and I can't complain. And the Florida as a state seems to be doing very well as far as COVID goes, I think. I mean, I haven't run into any problems. Yeah.
Good. So I wanted to bring you both on, and listeners out there, Karen and Lauren have not met before, but Karen is the mother of one of my best friends, and Lauren also knows the daughter as well. So that's kind of how we're all connected. This is the first time they're meeting. And the reason I specifically chose Lauren and Karen is because Karen, for me, when I was, coming of sexual maturity and had all this confusion, was an adult who actually was okay talking about it. And there was no shame when she spoke about it. It was very matter of fact. And I always really looked up to her for that. I always thought she was really badass, really cool. And Lauren is someone of my age. So we're like a millennial generation, whereas Karen, you're from the baby boomer generation, which is, the ages between now of 57 and 75. Whereas Lauren and I are the millennials, which is the ages of 25 to 40. And Lauren and I I chose Lauren because she's always been very comfortable talking about sex, just like myself. So I'm hoping we're going to have a really interesting discussion with the intention to get an understanding of how the pressures and attitudes towards sex and gender roles have changed in just one generation. So baby boomer to millennials. I'm going to start off by reading a quote. It's modified, which is from Girls, 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 which I believe demonstrates like the conflicting pressures that women in both the millennial and baby boomer generation, perhaps at varying levels, still face. So here we go. Be a lady, they said. Remove your body hair, wax this, bleach that. Don't be a temptress. Look sexy. Don't be too fat. Don't be too thin. Plump your lips. Look natural. Don't be too loud. Don't be intimidating. Fold his clothes, cook him dinner. Save yourself. Men don't like girls who sleep around. You hyphenated your name, crazy feminist. Don't walk alone. Don't smile at strangers. Don't say yes. Don't say no. Be a lady, they said. So for me, this brought me to tears because it was an internal like conflict that I had in myself when I was a teenager. And I didn't realize how conflicting what we're told to be is until I heard this. Karen, did this quote resonate with you?
Well, on so many levels, because, of course, my mother was a huge influence on me during those times when I was growing up in my sort of fledgling sexual forays, let's say. And, with what you just read, it was very much like that, especially in those days. I mean, those were the days that my mother would get dressed for dinner. If dinner wasn't on the table at the right time, if she wasn't looking desirable or sexy, and having her martini ready for her husband. And so, to read that, it feels so oppressive, because that's exactly what my introduction to how I was supposed to be as a female. Now, I was quite a tomboy when I was young. I was always hanging out with my brother and doing climbing trees and riding my bike and all that stuff. So it seemed fairly insignificant to me when I was 12 or 13. But by the time I was sort of 15 and 16, of course, um, there was a lot of sexual foray going on in my home, because my parents were now separated and my mother was quite promiscuous. And I had an older sister. And so there were a lot of incredibly conflicting messages to me, because um, it started out where my mom was very conservative and stayed when she was with my father. And then when they split, it was a whole different scenario. So I was seeing different men come into the house, right or wrong, no judgment on it. But at the time, it was a very difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. So I basically almost stayed um, androgynous in a way. Like I didn't want anything to do with it because it scared me. Now I was only, let's say, 14 or 15 at this time, in that time frame. And as far as my mother, I just have to tell you a quick story. My brother once had an appendicitis attack, and my mother, it was late at night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, and my brother was dying, really, because his appendix burst. And I went into my mother's bedroom and said, "Mom, we've got to get my brother to the hospital." And she was in putting makeup on, saying that she thought she might meet a nice doctor there.
Oh
So
my God.
this kind of thing really, it scared me. I have to tell you, I was very confused and conflicted, and had to find my own way through, because I really didn't have the kind of direction that would have been healthy. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, no, for sure. And no judgment at all on like your mother as well. Like you said, we have no idea, or maybe you do, the kind of pressures that she had from her upbringing as well. Lauren,
Exactly.
exactly. Lauren, what did you think when you read this quote?
My initial reaction was, oh, that might not resonate for me. I grew up in this progressive, liberal family where we spoke about sexuality, and I never felt I needed to feel ashamed of, or, um, you know, particularly, I never really felt particularly conflicted in my own sexuality. And that was my first initial reaction. And then I sat with it and I started to realize, no, it might be easy for me to push that aside as if it doesn't necessarily resonate for my own life. And maybe my parents didn't give me that kind of conflicting messages. But then I started to think about, okay, wider than my own sort of nuclear home, culture, media, my friends' parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and all of that. And I started to build sort of more whole picture and actually let myself take that quote in. And I started to realize that actually the paradoxical messaging that we all receive, definitely as women, um, perhaps as men as well, which maybe we can get into, but the scripts that are contradictory for women, I've definitely internalized in a less, um, I'll call it a less explicit manner. I've almost implicitly internalized those scripts. And to the point where when I was in the 10th grade, um, I felt I went on a trip to Italy and I gained a lot of weight in my gelato and pasta eating. And then when I got home from that trip, I felt so terrified of being fat that I started extreme dieting as a 15 or 16-year-old and became way too thin, like on the path to severe anorexia. Um, and luckily didn't get too far down that road. But I bring that up as an example of how, even me, somebody who, when I first read that quote, I felt, oh, lucky my parents didn't give me this kind of paradoxical, contradictory messaging. And then I thought, no, well, I didn't get it from my parents, but I got it from my own internalized experience of my culture, to the point that I literally let myself starve to meet that paradoxical norm.
Yeah. Wow, Lauren, thank you for sharing that. It's so insightful as well, because I definitely felt those pressures of, I grew up in Bermuda, which was very worshiping of like a thicker build. And then I went to high school in Canada. And oh my God, that is when the like body issues started. No men will want you if you are too fat. I remember specifically I was in the cafeteria, and these like senior boys made a riddle up for me to figure out that I had gained weight from September to June. And I remember crying in the bathroom, and also going through, okay, I need to diet if I want boys to desire me. And
Mhm.
what's interesting is, I think we're all saying, I also had super progressive parents, but society and different cultures really has a profound impact on you. And so, something I wanted to discuss was, I was reading this study called the General Social Survey in North America, which compares attitudes across multiple generations um, towards sexual attitudes. And I looked at it specifically for today between the baby boomers generation and the millennials. So, Karen, your generation, you came of sexual maturity in the 70s, which we reflect as a time period known as like the sexual revolution. Yet a
Mhm.
study during that time found that 71% of the population believed sex before marriage was wrong. While Lauren and we came of sexual maturity in 2010 to 2012. And of that time, it said 42% of the population believed sex before marriage was wrong. So these are really, really high. And of course, these are going to have a profound impact of like on you, perhaps on your parents. So, Karen, what were the social attitudes that you felt were prevalent for having sex before marriage when you were young, from like a society standpoint?
Well, I think that there was, still a very strong sentiment to be conservative, and that you were still expected to, sort of marry out of college and end up with a husband and three children and dinner on the table and so on and so forth. But for me, it was a little bit different because of my background with my parents. And Lauren, thank you so much for sharing what you did, because the same thing sort of resonated with me when I did read how I felt about that statement that you read earlier, Jessica, was that I remember always having this feeling of being, you have to smile, you have to be attractive, you have to be thin, you have to be all of this sort of this stereotypical female, and I never did resonate with that. So now, growing up in the 70s, it was all that time of free love and lots of experimentation with different drugs were going on at that time. It was really, and there was a lot of autonomy too, because we didn't have cell phones and internet and all that stuff, which is what you guys have grown up with, which was very, very different, because we were able to be quite free with what it was we would, be able to do without being traced or tracked or anything like that. Um, there was, I'm sure, in a societal sense, still the idealism that we were supposed to be good girls, find one boyfriend, stick with him, get married, and have children. And that was, of course, what was going on in that decade, even though there was this rebellion and this free love going on. And but for me, that was still very much the norm, what was expected. I just remembered being told to smile a lot, you know, smile and look pretty. These were the sorts of things that I was always told to do, and I of course rebelled against that because I found it benign. You know, it was like this wasn't me, and I wasn't going to succumb to that type of pressure, and I didn't. But as far as what the culture of that time was very much still sort of brought on from the 50s and 60s. You know,
Mhm.
that's what I think, you know,
Yeah.
happened
a-
there.
And something interesting from what I read, which I didn't expect, is, the generation between Karen, you and your own mother was
Yes,
way drastically different than your generation and ours. So
exactly.
the
Yeah.
study, we actually haven't made. So this study says, millennials, the one I mentioned before, millennials embrace more permissive attitudes towards non-marital sex, but reported fewer sexual partners than those born in the 60s, which
Yes, and I would
which I
agree
found
with
that
that.
very interesting.
Yeah, and I would agree with that statement because, you know, I think that there was there was so much repression that happened in the 30s and 40s and 50s. You know, everybody was, you know, there was not a lot of authenticity with who people really were because there was such societal pressure you know, sit up straight. This is the other thing I remember when I was in grade 4 and 5. We would have to have posture classes where ladies would sit with their legs crossed at the ankles, and I was only, you know, what, 10, 8, 9, 10. Keep my back straight. You know, the teachers would walk around with a ruler to keep you sitting up straight, so that it was all about being proper. And you know, the jump from when I had my children and how my mother was, it's incredibly changed. You know, so I agree with that.
I had
Yeah.
posture awards too, Karen. I
Did
remember,
you?
yes, I did. And I won, which is
You
hilarious
did?
because I am so far from, like, I always really struggled with this whole be a lady thing. And I remember,
Right.
yeah, like I remember I would even judge myself on, like, I would be
Yeah.
embarrassed that I had messy handwriting because it wasn't desirable. Like I didn't want to be
Yes.
seen as a disorganized woman. And I
Yeah.
remember even that is still ingrained in me today, to the
Mhm.
point where one of my colleagues at work, like, like saw me making notes, and he leaned over and he said, "Wow, Jess, I did not think that you of all people would have messy handwriting." And I was so embarrassed. I was like, "Oh, well, I was just trying to jot things down quickly. I normally have really good
Right.
handwriting." And then I was like,
Right.
"Why do I care whether or not he thinks I have good handwriting?" So it's
Yeah.
ingrained in posture, in handwriting, in table manners, which I've always struggled with. So it really, in that sense, we have so many similarities still. The growth
Yeah.
between your generation and ours has not been as big. So, going to you, Lauren, what are some of the sexual messages that you received growing up? You said you were empowered, but society felt otherwise. How did this affect your attitude about, sexual desire and intimacy now?
Hmm, that's a great question.
It is.
The sexual messages that I received growing up, um, although we grew up, as Karen mentioned, with the internet and then later with cell phones, we didn't grow up with social media. And so I think about the sexual messages my younger cousins, as an example, are receiving growing up with social media, versus the sexual messages that I received growing up, where perhaps seeking out information about sexuality or, you know, coming into your own sexual being, you almost had to go out of your way, or you had to do some discovery, meaning some effortful seeking. Whereas kids today, teens today, are flooded with sexual messaging. And as you were speaking, Karen, I had this uh, aha moment of, wow, social media is almost taking us backwards to the 50s and 60s, where what happens are girls who meet this, top down cultural idea of what a beautiful, proper woman is, and they post that imagery onto their social media profiles, they're rewarded with tons of likes and popularity and dopamine hits associated with said likes and popularity. And so social media is almost taking us back. To answer your question about, my particular experience with sexual messages growing up, I have always been a very sexual being prior to even knowing I was a sexual being. I guess all of us were. Like, I used to masturbate before knowing what masturbating was, and I called it my vagina taste. And I would tell my friends, I had no idea what it was. And then when I found out what masturbating was, I was like, is that what I'm doing?
Yeah.
I didn't have any older siblings. I think my friends who had older siblings got much more sort of sexual information at a younger age than I did. And I just had more, instead of sort of sexual messaging, I would call it sexual impulses. I had more sexual impulses than I had sexual messaging. And over time, I had to really seek out the information to label those impulses. Does
Well,
that make sense?
one thing I'd say is there is a strong connection between your sexual, like what you're told, your sexual beliefs, like what you said, your mom's very liberal, was very liberal. It was talked about in the household. So sexual attitude, the link between your sexual attitude and your sexual behavior is very strong. And even though you said, correct me if you think this is wrong, but even though you said you felt a lot of, different conflicting messages otherwise, I think what your parents are telling you is the most fundamental and the most you take on.
Definitely. It would have been a much more different experience growing up with parents
Yeah.
who were, I'll call it, to use Karen's language, a bit more repressive.
What about you, Karen?
Well, I need to jump in here because, when we talk about the slut shaming, and for me, my father, who was quite, he was a workaholic and he was quite absent, and especially after my parents were separated and divorced, I remember this one incident where my father's girlfriend at the time, my father had a place up north, an hour outside of Toronto, and my father's girlfriend was fooling around on him, and she was using our sort of guest cottage as a place to take her lovers. And I remember I was 15. I remember this like the back of my hand, and my father came over to the house that my mother and brother and sister were living in at the time, and he walked in the door, and I remember I was standing on the staircase, and I was so happy to see him. And I remember him walking in the door, and I said, "Oh, Dad, you're here. This is great to see you." And he looked at me and he said, "You slut." Now, I was a virgin at the time, and I can still feel it resonating in my body now because I was so shocked at what he said to me. And I looked at him and I said, "What did you just say, Dad?" I said, "I'm a virgin." And he said to me, "You've been up at at the guest cottage with different boys." And I still to this day, I can almost feel it, just resonating in my body. So for me, my parents did have, my mother was promiscuous, my father's girlfriend was promiscuous, and my father called me a slut when I was a virgin. So this had a tremendous impact on me, and my sort of relation with my own sexuality. And Lauren, I have to say that was really, really wonderful of you to say you started masturbating. It was the same for me. When I was 11, 12, I was like, this is the greatest thing since this is great, um, not having any idea that this was sex or anything to do, is just felt great, right? And so as these things progressed for me, as the years went by and I was being, constantly bombarded also with my sister. I have an older sister, 4 years older. So she would have her boyfriend's friends come around. And I have been sexually assaulted a number of times during that from 12 to, let's say, 15 or 16, where they would just come and, touch my breasts or try and touch my vagina and stuff like this. And so it was a very different time because there were so many conflicting messages, you know, um, with, I think, societal sexuality at that in the 70s. It was a mixed up time for both parents, my generation, my sister's generation, being born in the, you know, the earlier part of the 50s. Very, very difficult, I would have to say. And most of my early experiences with 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 having to do with any kind of intimacy was not good for me because men at that time, especially, you know, men that were 22 and younger, they would just assume that, you know, it was free game. And the more naive you were about anything, which I was, the more they could take advantage, and they did. So, you know, I've had to grow into my ability to have trust and be free flowing with my true innate authentic sexuality, you know, because the those early years were very, very difficult, especially when my father called me a slut, because at that point I was like, am I not, am I a
Mm,
virgin, what does that mean, you know?
yes.
It was really, really a difficult time for me. Now I don't know, you know, if you spoke to somebody else that grew up in my generation, if they would have, I'm sure it would be a very different story, but that was, you know, that was my experience.
Yeah.
um
Thank you, Karen, first of all, for sharing your story about sexual assault. That must have been horrendous. And
it was, yeah.
I think it's interesting what you're saying is, you know, perhaps the naivety, you know, that's what you said, you weren't informed and men took advantage of that. Um, and
Totally.
and
Yeah.
I really think, you know, even now we have all these talks at schools like no means no, what is consent? But I don't think it's improved. And I personally have had, you know, multiple experiences sexually where they were very questionable. Um,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I particularly remember one time where I was, you know, making out with this guy and that's all I wanted. And I
Hmm.
remember he kept pushing me and pushing me and I kept saying no and he took that as an invitation. And this is not
Right.
long ago. You know, this is well after the no means no. Um
Hmm.
so it is so scary. And I don't think I was naive. So I even had my wits about me and it's still you still find yourself in those situations. You know, it's
Yes.
very scary. And the safety of women, I don't know if it has improved. Lauren, have you ever encountered any situation, perhaps
Hmm.
sexually or maybe not, where you felt in danger?
Yeah, both. So I wouldn't. I've experienced a similar situation to you, Jess. You know, you're fooling around with someone and they take it too far and they presume. I think again the paradoxes that we receive as women culturally are actually quite similar to the paradoxes that men receive
Hmm.
prior to this whole no means no and Me Too movement really. I think men were taught, you know, women are going to say no, right? They're going to say no to be a lady, but they don't mean it when they say no. And young men, I know I went to summer camp in 2006, 2007, and male counselors would teach that to their male campers, you know. But yes, I have experienced uncomfortable sexual encounters where I feel pressured to go farther than I want to go. And although I wouldn't say I would position myself in a particular memory that I'm thinking of as somewhere in between you and Karen, with, you know, thinking of Karen as a young girl who wasn't necessarily equipped with the language or toolkit to say no, based
Hmm.
on, because of all of the paradoxical messages. I wouldn't even call it naivete. I would just call it, you know, you're unequipped, versus you, who you you had sort of an education around this specifically and you were saying no. I would position myself sort of in the middle of, I'm unsure if this is to cross the line or not. I don't want to say no so explicitly. And so, in not saying no so explicitly, anything that happens here is consensual and is sort of uh, almost my fault, which is another interesting thing we could unpack.
Hmm.
Um, But yeah, I've had one particular experience that was just in the middle of both of you, and reflecting on it is what made me think like, whoa, that was really out of line. And if any of my uh, cues were cared for at all, that would not have happened. But my cues were not. I don't think I didn't necessarily. I wouldn't have labeled it assault per se because I didn't say, no, get off of me in the same way that you might have, Jess.
Even though I said no, I didn't say get off me, but I didn't say, but it's the way you deliver it, right? Even though I was trying to
Yes.
move his hand away, even though I said no, perhaps if I said it more firm, he would have listened. But it doesn't matter how I say it. The words came out of my mouth, no, and he took advantage
Continued.
anyways. So I think it's
Enacting.
interesting
Yeah.
what you say about that feeling of, is it your own fault? And I guess, Karen, from your dad calling you, slut shaming you when you
Mhm.
were a virgin, did you feel these sexual assaults were your own fault?
Well, I mean, there was certainly shame around it, unwarranted shame. And I think that even as I'm thinking about it now, I think that the shame that I sort of took in from my mother and the way that she behaved and what I was witnessing from someone I should have looked up to that way for some kind of guidance. I think that I, intrinsically took on the shame of my mother. Now that I'm thinking about it, I really haven't put much thought to it until we're bringing this in now. But I think I felt, I felt ashamed that my father would think that of me, and then I think I felt some responsibility for the actions of my mom at the time. And so, it was a very convoluted, and I was assaulted a lot. My first sexual experience was a rape. And that was also really put me behind the eight ball as far as feeling, comfortable with, says I almost wanted to stay away from it all because these experiences were so detrimental to my understanding of allowing intimacy and true relational sexual encounters to take place of a real authentic way. So it took me quite some time to get there. I eventually did have some wonderful, wonderful lovers and some beautiful, supportive relationships. But those early years for me did encompass a lot of dysfunction that way. So that one rape instance, and I'll just tell you this: I was 15. I was babysitting for a friend of mine, and an older friend's brother came over, who I thought was very cute. He was probably 18 or 19 at the time, and of course, I had this little sort of girl crush on him. And I went to bed that night because it was an overnight babysitting job. And he just came into my room and basically laid on top of me, and that was that. And I was paralyzed.
Oh
I
my
mean,
God.
this is what happens. You become paralyzed verbally. You become paralyzed physically. I had no voice
Yeah.
because that fear comes in, and
Hmm.
this complete control. And at that time too, for me, I had really no idea of, if I was called a slut, maybe I was one. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
With still being a virgin. Very, very confusing. So I think that I'm loving now what's going on with the Me Too movement, and that there's a lot of, much more societal pressure on men to take responsibility for their actions.
I think a really important piece to add is a point about male allies. And
Mm.
although culturally, uh, perhaps the cultural view is a little bit grim, maybe things haven't necessarily changed much, but the idea of holding hands with our brothers and sisters and speaking up against injustices and having male allies who speak up against injustices as women, towards women, excuse me, which happens every single day. I
Yeah.
can proudly say that my brother and my boyfriend and my best male friends are allies towards women who experience
Mhm.
injustice.
It's a
Hmm.
constant moving forward. We just have to keep moving
Mm.
forward with greater knowledge and greater understanding of both of our humanness, really. you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree
Absolutely.
more. I couldn't agree more.
Yes.
And to add to that point, I think we need more women allies. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
absolutely,
We
Jessica.
are all
God.
the
Absolutely.
problem, all of us,
Y-
we
Yeah,
really are.
you're right. You're right. You're right.
Yeah, I think another piece to that I want to add from your parents' generation, the repression of the 30s up until now, is
Hmm.
this idea of being very careful about your reputation, right?
Right.
Um, I have a memory of being really young, maybe 12, 13, on a walk with my grandpa. Um, and a, a adorable old lady came up to us and said hi to my grandpa. I haven't seen you in so long. How are you? It was a lovely interaction. And she walks away, this cute elderly lady. And my grandpa looks at me and smiles and he says, "She's always been a slut."
Oh,
Oh my
oh my
God.
Right?
God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
so damaging for you to hear because that is your insight into the male brain. What do they think? Did you feel any pressures like with clothes? Was there a correlation with clothes and sexuality for you?
I think that especially for women, clothes are very symbolic, and and they can be used as a form of protection or as a form of signaling. I, for my master's degree, my thesis was on female entrepreneurs. Clothing actually was a symbol that came up quite a bit, with how to signal who you are in that space. I remember one of my participants um, had a very similar early childhood experiences to you, Karen, with a lot of assault and rape and trauma, really.
Hmm.
And
Trauma. Yeah.
she had this beautiful long hair, this beautiful long mane, and after one of those instances, she cut it as an act of self-protection and empowerment. And her mother was, how could you cut your beautiful hair? And men were like, how could you cut your beautiful hair? And she cut her hair as an empowering sense of protection. And I can do this for myself. And she always wore high neck, turtlenecks, etc. And took her
Yeah,
really
and
long
that is that
time to.
that is
Mhm.
a form of protection for sure. It's
Yeah.
it's that signaling that you were saying, I mean, if I would, wear a tight dress even when I was in my 40s, I'm a attractive woman. And so if I would wear uh,
Yeah,
uh
you are, Karen.
thank you, love, but if I would wear a gorgeous outfit, I would find also too that the women, this goes two ways because you have jealousy from women and then they're, you know, bitches. And then you get the man who is thinking you're available, whether married or in a relationship or not, that he's got a chance to have you. I mean, it's so conflicting.
What do
It
you
is.
think about this?
I think one really interesting thing I wanted to raise is about this idea of balancing attractiveness and safety. You know, to feel, Karen mentions putting on a beautiful outfit.
Mhm.
Um, I have a specific memory of getting dressed up for this party I was going to and putting on a beautiful outfit and high heels, and then having to take the metro or the tube to get there. And the second I stepped onto the tube, I felt unsafe. I'm dressed like this on the tube. Um, it's unsafe to look attractive in this context.
Mhm.
Um, and I think all of it is really, really complex. And just don't think uh, that there's any sort of simple response. I want to say, dress in a way that makes you feel empowered, period. And it's not your responsibility to dress in a way that you are protected from the violence that happens towards women's bodies. It is culture's responsibility to drill into the heads of men and women that violence against any body is unacceptable.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
we're just not there. We're just
Yeah,
not
we're
there
not.
yet.
We're absolutely not there. And a good example of that is Sarah Everard. She was walking in Clapham Common in England, which is my neighborhood. Very safe. I thought so. I've done the same thing, walking home from a friend's house, at night, and not even late at night, wearing totally conservative clothes. There's a picture of her like in a raincoat, jeans. So not even like we said, dressed provocatively. And she was abducted by a police officer and killed. And So it doesn't matter if, even if we do cover up, we are still unsafe. And it is so scary that in a play, and what was so scary with Sarah's case is it was one of those examples where you're like, whoa, that could have been me.
He was a psychopath. I mean, obviously, we can't stop those kinds of, these mental,
Yes.
mentally ill people that will do anything to harm uh, animals and people. I mean, what a brutal story that was.
There is zero that any woman who's ever been abused, none of it is because of what she was wearing or what she has done. Like
Absolutely.
the language of like, even if we do cover up, she did everything right. She called her boyfriend. That's taking some of the responsibility onto the part of the woman. And
yes,
as
exactly.
and I think culturally we do that, because we want to feel safe. We want predictability and control and this sort of illusion of safety. And so we tell ourselves that there's all these things that we can do in order to protect ourselves. And so when something bad happens, consciously or unconsciously, a part of us wants to think like, okay, had she controlled the circumstances differently, she would have been safe, because we want to feel like if we control our circumstances in a certain way, we too will be safe.
Yeah,
and
That's right.
I'm also a bit remiss to call them mentally ill people, because I think people who have mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than they are to be perpetrators of crime.
Yeah, you're right about
I
that,
would,
Lauren. Yeah,
yeah,
you're right.
I would
And I
like to
shouldn't
call
have
them
sort of.
murderers.
Yeah, I would agree with Lauren on that. And I just want to say to you both, I think this has been so interesting. We've covered so much groundwork here, multi generations experience of, sex, consent, pressures in society with gender roles, and safety. So thank you so much for coming on and for cutting out the time to be with us today. And I hope we can meet up soon in the future. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Jessica. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye, Lauren. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to I Can Relate. If you'd like to hear more of these episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. You can do this on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or any other platform you're listening on. To become a part of the community, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Join me next time for another episode. Thanks for listening.